Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I hereby declare open the second meeting of the 48th session of the Human Rights Council. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we shall now begin the enhanced interactive dialogue on the High Commissioner's oral update on the situation of human rights in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, pursuant to Resolution 47/13. It is my honor to welcome our distinguished presenters, Ms. Michelle Bachelet, High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mr. Daniel Bekele, Chief Commissioner of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, the Honorable Mr. Remi Ngoe Lumbu, Vice Chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, who will speak online, and His Excellency Mr. Gedeon Timotheus Essebon, Attorney General of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. Welcome. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I now give the floor to the High Commissioner for her presentation. Madam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam President, Excellencies. I thank you for the opportunity to brief this Council on the grave human rights situation in the Tigray region of Ethiopia since my last update in June and based on my office's global mandate. Fighting has continued unabated and has expanded to neighboring Afar and Amhara regions. Together with other pockets of intercommunal violence, the conflict risks spilling over to the whole Horn of Africa. In the last few months, mass detentions, killings, systematic looting, and sexual violence have continued to create an atmosphere of fear and an erosion of living conditions that resulted in the forced displacement of the Tigrayan civilian population. Civilian suffering is widespread and impunity is pervasive. Even with the changing dynamics in the conflict, there has been one constant: multiple and severe reports of alleged gross violations of human rights, humanitarian, and refugee law by all parties. Excellencies, in the context of this ongoing human rights crisis, I appreciate the governments of Ethiopia cooperation with the Ohchr Ethiopia Human Rights Commission joint investigation. I also thank the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, led by the Chief Commissioner and my regional representative in Addis Ababa, for their leadership in this difficult and complex undertaking and urge them to continue their efforts. By way of an update, the first two field deployments went ahead as planned to Mekelle, parts of eastern Tigray and southern Tigray. However, due to sudden changes in the security situation and in the conflict dynamics, the team had to shorten its stay in Maikadra, and deployments to east and central Tigray, including Aksum, could not proceed. The joint report with its findings and recommendations is expected to be released on November 2021. It is already clear that cases documented comprise multiple allegations of human rights violations, including attacks on civilians, extrajudicial killings, torture, and forced disappearances, among other grave abuses. Sexual and gender-based violence has been characterized by a pattern of extreme brutality, including gang rapes, sexualized torture, and ethnically targeted sexual violence. I acknowledge the government's express commitment towards accountability for sexual violence, and I look forward to hearing about the outcomes of any actions taken. Excellencies, from my last update to the Council to date, allegations of human rights violations have continued to implicate government forces and its allies. We have received disturbing reports that local fishermen found dozens of bodies floating along the river crossing between Western Tigray and Sudan in July. Some allegedly had gunshot wounds and bound hands, indications that they might have been detained and tortured before being killed. There are continued reports of large-scale arbitrary detentions of ethnic Tigrayan civilians in unofficial sites in Western Tigray. Reports also suggest that people of Tigrayan ethnicity have been profiled and detained by law enforcement officials on ethnic grounds, with hundreds having reportedly been arrested in recent security sweeps, mostly in Addis Ababa, and several businesses belonging to ethnic Tigrayans having reportedly been closed. Incitement to hatred and discrimination and rising levels of inflammatory rhetoric were also documented, targeting people of Tigrayan ethnicity. History has unmistakably taught us the dangers of this kind of rhetoric. De-escalation measures must urgently be put in place. Threats and attacks on journalists have also been reported, as well as the suspension of media outlets licenses and intermittent restriction and shutdowns of internet and telecommunications in Tigray. Excellencies, since gaining control of part of Tigray and expanding to neighboring regions, reports have also identified Tigrayan forces as perpetrators of human rights abuses. During the period under review, the Tigrayan forces have allegedly been responsible for attacks on civilians, including indiscriminate killings resulting in nearly 76,500 people displaced in Afar and an estimated 200,000 in Amhara. More than 200 individuals have reportedly been killed in the most recent clashes in these regions, and 88 individuals, including children, have been injured. On 5th of August, Tigrayan forces allegedly attacked and killed displaced people, mainly women, children, and older people sheltering in a camp in Galikoma Kebele in the Afar region. We have also received serious reports of recruitment of children into the conflict by Tigrayan forces, which is prohibited under international law. Excellencies, while I remain extremely concerned by the human rights situation in Tigray and neighboring regions, I have taken note of the government's earlier commitment to accountability for human rights violation in Tigray. In my meeting last June with the Attorney General, he informed me about some of the measures the government was taking, including prosecuting sexual and gender-based violence. I look forward to hearing about the government's progress in this regard, emphasizing the need for transparency and in any such proceedings as an important part of redress for victims. I also urge the government of Ethiopia to accept the recommendation of the Joint Investigation Report as part of its effort to bring about accountability. International, regional, national human rights and humanitarian actors must be given unhindered access. I also reiterate my call to the Eritrean government to ensure accountability for alleged widespread human rights violation by their forces in the Tigray region. Beyond Tigray, further efforts are required to put an end to deadly intercommunal violence, and the response cannot be a military one. I reiterate what I told the Council last June. Grievances must be addressed through meaningful peace building and reconciliation efforts to avoid the risk that Ethiopia will be torn apart, with profound implications for the country and the rest of the Horn of Africa. The solution to the conflict in Tigray can only be found through a political process and dialogue. I commend the African Union's mediation efforts in this regard. I call on all parties to immediately end hostilities without preconditions and negotiate a lasting ceasefire. Looking ahead, a sustainable peace will only come through accountability, a genuine inclusive dialogue, and a national reconciliation process. More substantive effort must be undertaken by all sides to renew the social contract between the government and its people. Only when this is in place will Ethiopia be able to fully enjoy their fundamental rights and freedoms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I now give the floor to Mr. Daniel Bekele for his presentation. Sir, the floor is yours.
Excellency, President of the Human Rights Council, distinguished members of the Council, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols duly observed. I also thank the opportunity to join you for this enhanced interactive dialogue. As the High Commissioner indicated, the joint investigation by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN Human Rights Office into alleged violations committed by all parties of the conflict in Tigray has now concluded its field level work, and the team is currently analyzing the full range of information collected. Therefore, given that we're still at the stage of analyzing the information and evidences we have gathered, and in accordance with the terms of reference and other agreed documents between the two institutions, we are not yet in a position to share any findings or conclusions at this stage. But the High Commissioner has also indicated the types of human rights issues we investigate against all parties to the conflict include attacks against civilians and civilian objects and other protected persons and objects, unlawful or extrajudicial killings, forced displacement of people, sexual and gender-based violence, torture and other ill treatment, arbitrary detention, abduction, and enforced disappearances and violations against refugees. I just wish to urge members of the Council and others to wait for the final report of the joint investigation, which is expected to be published on the 1st of November, which will include our findings, conclusions, and recommendations. While we wait for the final report, I wish to share the following observations on the recent developments and the overall environment affecting the human rights and humanitarian situation on the basis of my Commission's ongoing monitoring activities to help inform the dialogue of this Council. Members of the Council, you would recall that the last resolution of this Council on Tigray coincided with the first full week since the announcement of a ceasefire by the Ethiopian government on the 28th of June. At the time, the ceasefire and the military developments seemed to indicate and indeed gave hope for an improvement of the humanitarian situation as well as a pathway to peace. The humanitarian report of that first week of July stated, I quote, humanitarian access had been significantly improving and 75% of the population were at the time living in areas where relief operations can take place, end of the quote. However, less than 3 weeks into July, significant challenges emerged. TPLF put forward a set of preconditions to accept the ceasefire. It launched military offensive on neighboring regions. Movement of aid convoys were hampered, and it was followed by regrouping of military forces in neighboring regions, national mobilization for war, and counteroffensive military operations. I think it soon became clear that the communication, other public services, and humanitarian assistance will continue to be affected with the escalation of hostilities. Therefore, it does seem to me that the Tigray conflict itself has now become a misnomer. Between July and August, more than 10 semi-urban or rural areas in neighboring Afar and Amhara regions, as the High Commissioner has indicated, have changed hands at least once. Tens of thousands of people have been displaced in these two regions, which is adding to the massive toll of displacement in Tigray and other parts of the country. Military clashes and movement have alternated between targeting transportation routes, civilian population, and infrastructure. And a far cry from the expected respite during the Ethiopian rainy season for agriculture and recovery, entire productive economies have been disrupted. Despite the misinformation campaign and social media frenzy, I do hope Council members should also be cognizant that the human rights story of all these conflicts, including in Tigray, is not merely a black and white narrative. It has nuanced complexities, and soldiers or fighters of all parties to the conflict and their affiliated groups are credibly implicated with violence against civilians and civilian infrastructure, including sexual violence and use of child soldiers. While we understand that the security problems created by the spread of the conflict to neighboring regions has slowed down humanitarian assistance, we remain concerned by the still dire humanitarian situation, particularly of IDPs. The federal government, the local authorities in the region, as well as the humanitarian agencies should redouble their efforts to ensure uninterrupted and improved provision of humanitarian assistance to civilians in Tigray and neighboring regions. The slow but gradual overtures to negotiation from both sides and some initiatives proposed by the international community are encouraging. However, if Ethiopia's international partners trying to address the human rights crisis are to have a meaningful and constructive role, they should always work with full understanding of history and context of this complex political crisis. Let me conclude by saying that the Council members and the international community should be really cognizant that it is still people of Ethiopia who have the highest stake in putting an end to the suffering of fellow Ethiopians. It's a principle that defines national sovereignty, but it is also a human standard to live up to. This requires the humility to understand that there is no political righteousness or no just cause, that no amount of political righteousness and just cause can justify the extent of the human suffering we have lived through other people and as a country during this war. It also requires the humility to understand that the available national, legal, and institutional parameters are far from being perfect, but they remain, in every sense, the most relevant and the most cost-effective tools for addressing the human rights crisis, as well as finding a sustainable solution out of this war. Therefore, we urge all parties to the conflict, as well as the international partners, to reach into this humility. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much indeed. And I now give the floor to Mr. Remy Ngoe Lumbu for his presentation. He will speak by video message.
Mesdames, Mesdemoiselles et Messieurs, c'est pour moi un honneur de vous présenter le message de la Commission africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples à cette 48e session du Conseil des droits de l'homme. Avant toute chose, permettez-moi de remercier le président du Conseil des droits de l'homme, son Excellence Nazat Chamen-Khan, qui m'a demandé de venir prendre part à ce dialogue interactif renforcé sur la situation des droits de l'homme en province du Tigray, à ma qualité de vice-président de la Commission africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples et de président de la commission d'enquête sur la situation des droits de l'homme dans cette partie de la République fédérale démocratique d'Éthiopie. Nous le savons tous, depuis novembre 2020, il existe des violences au niveau de la province du Tigray. Cela a entraîné, comme conséquence notamment, des violations graves et massives des droits de l'homme. Plusieurs acteurs locaux et étrangers seraient impliqués dans ce conflit. La Commission africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples, en tant que principal organe en charge de la promotion et de la protection des droits de l'homme en Afrique, n'est pas restée indifférente face à cette situation. Plusieurs initiatives ont été formulées depuis lors, en voici quelques-unes. Le mécanisme du rapporteur pays a publié un communiqué de presse en date du 26 novembre 2020. Deuxièmement, la Commission a adopté la résolution 469 le 3 décembre 2020, suggérant aux autorités nationales de mener des enquêtes rapides, impartiales et efficaces. La Commission a également adopté une résolution conformément à la Charte africaine des droits de l'homme et du peuple, créant depuis le 7 mai 2021 sa propre commission d'enquête. Celle-ci a pour mandat, inter alia, d'enquêter sur les allégations de violations du droit international des droits de l'homme, du droit international humanitaire, et d'établir les faits et circonstances qui pourraient constituer des violations graves et massives des droits de l'homme. Les travaux de cette commission ont été lancés officiellement le 17 juin 2021, presque au même moment que ceux du Haut Commissariat des Nations Unies qui s'était déployé sur terrain au cours de la même période. Nos travaux se déroulent en deux phases. Une première phase d'audition des acteurs impliqués est en cours et s'achèvera dans quelques semaines. Il y aura une seconde phase de descente sur terrain qui commencera dans les prochains jours. Les résultats de nos investigations seront disponibles d'ici la fin de cette année et seront consignés dans un rapport qui sera mis à la disposition de tous les acteurs. La Commission africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples saisit cette occasion pour renouveler le vœu de collaboration avec tous les acteurs qui s'intéressent à ce conflit, en respectant non seulement les droits de l'homme reconnus aux Éthiopiens tels qu'ils sont protégés par la Charte africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples, mais en respectant aussi la souveraineté de l'Éthiopie et les textes de base qui organisent le travail au sein de l'Union africaine. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, and I wish to advise all delegations that the list of speakers is now closed. I now give the floor to Mr. Gideon Essebon for his presentation. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Madam President, distinguished delegates, all protocols observed. I would like to begin my remarks by thanking the President of the Council for the invitation to participate in this enhanced interactive dialogue. I would like to take this opportunity to reiterate the position of the government of Ethiopia that all credible allegations of serious human rights violations that have been reported in relation to the situation in Tigray and other regions in Ethiopia should be thoroughly investigated. In line with this commitment, the appropriate state organs of the government of Ethiopia have launched investigations into allegations of serious human rights violations and have undertaken measures to ensure accountability and bring perpetrators of violations to justice. In addition to these investigations and accountability measures that have already been taken, the government of Ethiopia has also facilitated the launch of a joint investigation by the Ethiopian and UN Human Rights Commissions. In their statement issued just before this session, the heads of the two commissions have expressed their view that the joint exercise has been a robust, impartial, and independent investigation. While we'll have to wait for some time before the findings and recommendations of the investigation are issued, we would like to recognize the endeavor of the UN High Commission for Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission to conduct a credible investigation. In accordance with established practices and procedures, we also look forward to receiving the advanced copy of their joint findings and questions with adequate time to submit the government's response and explanations to meet the pertinent standards of a balanced and credible report. The government of Ethiopia is committed to carefully consider and take under advisement the findings and recommendations of the joint investigation. We are optimistic that the finding of the joint investigation would help provide clarity and be of assistance in the effort to ensure accountability. As I have noted earlier, federal and military prosecutors have pressed charges and taken other appropriate legal and disciplinary measures against several individuals that have been suspected of committing various types of human rights violations. The joint investigation could complement these judicial and legal proceedings that are underway by highlighting areas and issues that need more attention. However, I must point out that the temporal scope of the joint investigation is such that the findings would be incomplete. It's our understanding that the cutoff period for the joint investigation is the declaration of the unilateral humanitarian ceasefire by the federal government. This means the egregious and deplorable human rights violations that have been committed by the TPLF in the Afar and Amhara regional state, including but not limited to the extensive use of child soldiers, the killing of hundreds of civilians in places such as Galikoma and Chena, would not be covered by the joint investigation. As a result, the report of the joint investigation would be incomplete and might not give a full picture. Be this as it may, we still appreciate the fact that this was an investigation that was done with a robust presence on the ground and a team composed of local and international experts. Regrettably, not all parties who claim to be undertaking an investigation have followed such an approach. For instance, the African Human and People's Rights Commission has unfortunately opted to conduct a unilateral investigation outside the scope of invitation extended to it by the government of Ethiopia. Contrary to established practices and procedures, the African Commission chose to engage in a process which is neither independent nor credible and hence not recognized by the government of Ethiopia. This anomalous process relies extensively on the supposed testimony gathered from refugee camps in Sudan, where many of those suspected of being responsible for the Ohchr massacre are present. There is also ample evidence that there are thousands of combatants in these refugee camps, many of whom are still actively engaged in hostilities against the government of Ethiopia. The government of Ethiopia would not recognize any inquiry that gives an opportunity to the perpetrators of a grave crime, an opportunity to pose as victims while denying their victims a fair chance to be heard. Such inquiry, with a flawed and misguided approach, cannot seriously be taken as a genuine, independent, and impartial human rights investigation. In conclusion, I would like to note that the government of Ethiopia will continue in its effort to overcome the challenge posed by a well-armed and financed terrorist entity that is trying to reverse the democratic gains of the past 3 years. We will continue to engage constructively with all relevant stakeholders for the improvement of the human rights situation in Ethiopia. In relation to this, we call upon the international community and the Human Rights Council to condemn the use of terrorist tactics, child soldiers, as well as the mass killing of civilians, the organized looting and wanton destruction that the TPLF has been inflicting in Afar and Amhara regional states. It is high time that the world wakes up to the reality that the TPLF is the aggressor and not the victim in this tragedy. I thank you.
I thank you. I now invite interested delegations to ask questions to the presenters and make comments on their statements. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union for a video statement.
The European Union remains extremely concerned about the conflict in Tigray and its extension into the neighbouring regions of Amhara and Afar. The EU calls on all parties to abide by their obligations to ensure full, safe and unfettered humanitarian access and full respect for IHL, and is gravely concerned about the persistent reports of the obstruction of humanitarian assistance. We reiterate our call to all parties to cease the numerous grave human rights violations and abuses, including sexual and gender-based violence, ethnically targeted violence, discrimination and hate speech. The EU also reiterates its call for the permanent withdrawal of Eritrean forces. We call on all parties to enter into a process of political dialogue. There can be no military solution to this conflict. All allegations of human rights violations and abuses and violations of IHL must be investigated, perpetrators brought to justice, and the rule of law restored. We understand that the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the office are finalizing their report. It will be an important tool for rendering justice, establishing accountability, and preventing further violations and abuses. We encourage publication as soon as possible and no later than the announced date. The EU also encourages the High Commissioner to keep the Council updated on any further developments intersessionally. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Sweden on behalf of a group of countries for a video statement.
The statement on behalf of the Nordic and Baltic countries. We welcome the update and share the deep concern for the human rights situation in Tigray and other regions of Ethiopia. Violence cannot solve the spiraling conflict in northern Ethiopia. We urge all parties to immediately cease fire without preconditions and negotiate a solution. Starvation must not be used as a weapon. We urge all parties to ensure full, immediate and unhindered humanitarian access to Tigray and surrounding regions. All human rights must be respected. We call on all parties to the conflict to comply with international humanitarian and refugee law and to protect civilians from sexual and gender-based violence, ethnic violence, displacement and harm. Any act of refoulement or forced returns of refugees or IDPs must be prevented. Returns must be safe, voluntary and dignified. All parties must refrain from incitement to hatred and violence. Eritrea's role in the ongoing conflict is cause for deep concern. We call on the Eritrean Defense Forces to withdraw immediately. We welcome the upcoming report of the joint investigation, which is an important step to ensure that all allegations of human rights violations and abuses are investigated. Perpetrators must be held accountable in an independent, transparent, and impartial manner. Madam High Commissioner, how can we support efforts to ensure accountability? Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the United States on behalf of a group of countries for a video statement.
Madam High Commissioner, this statement is delivered on behalf of about 40 countries. We underscore the importance of your joint investigation and call for the report to be released without delay. We remain gravely concerned by ongoing violence in northern Ethiopia. The Ethiopian government and regional authorities cutting off of Tigray and the TPLF's expansion of the conflict in the neighboring regions have caused a humanitarian catastrophe. We are deeply concerned by numerous reports of Eritrean Defense Forces engagement in serious human rights abuses, and we call on them to withdraw immediately. We're deeply concerned about the killing of civilians and humanitarian workers, as well as sexual and gender-based violence and attacks on Eritrean refugees and displaced persons in Ethiopia. Those responsible for human rights violations and abuses and violations of international humanitarian law must be held accountable. We call on all parties immediately to allow and facilitate safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access. We also urge the Ethiopian government and TPLF to enter ceasefire negotiations without preconditions. Our question is, will you brief the Council on the findings of the report once it is released? Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Cameroon on behalf of the Group of African States.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. La déclaration peut être consultée par extranet. Le groupe africain se félicite le président du Conseil des droits de l'homme pour avoir organisé ce dialogue interactif renforcé sur la situation des droits de l'homme dans la région du Tigray en Éthiopie et sur les progrès réalisés dans le cadre de l'enquête conjointe entre le Haut-Commissaire des Nations Unies aux droits de l'homme et la Commission éthiopienne des droits de l'homme. Le groupe africain apprécie la volonté du gouvernement de la République fédérale démocratique d'Éthiopie de prendre part à ce dialogue, ainsi que son engagement à coopérer et à faciliter la poursuite de l'enquête conjointe. Le groupe salue cette ouverture à une enquête indépendante et les mesures de responsabilisation qui ont déjà été prises par le gouvernement. Le groupe africain exhorte toutes les parties impliquées dans le conflit à respecter toutes les normes et tous les principes pertinents en matière de droits de l'homme. Le groupe africain souligne la nécessité d'un engagement constructif avec le haut-commissaire représentant l'Union africaine pour la région de la Corne de l'Afrique, son Excellence M. Olusegun Obasanjo, ancien président du Nigeria, tous les acteurs politiques et parties prenantes concernés, ainsi que la communauté internationale, afin de mettre fin aux souffrances des civils le plus rapidement possible. Le groupe africain apprécie, outre le cessez-le-feu humanitaire unilatéral déclaré par le gouvernement éthiopien. Le groupe africain appelle le gouvernement éthiopien à poursuivre les réformes politiques et institutionnelles qu'il a entamées il y a 3 ans et à s'appuyer sur les élections démocratiques qu'il vient d'organiser. Le groupe africain, enfin, espère que l'enquête conjointe sera menée à bien et applaudit ceux qui soutiennent ce processus. Je vous remercie, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Ethiopia on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm delivering this statement on behalf of like-minded states. Madam President, the like-minded states commends the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission for sharing with the Council the progress regarding the joint investigation. The like-minded group commends the measures taken by the government of Ethiopia to facilitate the ongoing joint investigation by the OHCHR and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. The finalization of this joint investigation will be of utmost importance in ensuring justice and accountability to the serious human rights violations that were committed during the conflict. While welcoming the humanitarian ceasefire that has been declared by the government of Ethiopia, the group notes with concern that the recent developments, particularly reports of mass killings of civilians and other atrocities in the Afar and Amhara region states, as well as the extensive use of child soldiers by the rebels, will not be covered by the joint investigation. In this context, the like-minded group encourages relevant national institutions in Ethiopia, including the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, to undertake the relevant measures with a view to hold perpetrators of the serious human rights violation accountable. In conclusion, Madam President, the like-minded states look forward for the conclusion of the joint investigation and encourages all, including Human Rights Council, to reinforce the support to the joint investigation by avoiding any deliberations and action, as it will be of utmost importance in its successful completion. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Liechtenstein for a video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. Liechtenstein thanks the High Commissioner for all update on the situation of human rights in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. We remain concerned over the human rights and humanitarian situation in Tigray and reiterate our strong call for thorough, impartial, and independent investigations into all allegations of serious violations and abuses of human rights law, as well as violations of humanitarian law, including abductions, extrajudicial killings and executions of civilians, arbitrary and incommunicado detention, widespread looting and pillage, sexual violence, and attacks on humanitarian workers. In this regard, we welcome the investigative efforts of the Ethiopian government jointly with the OHCHR and call on the High Commissioner for a timely release of the joint investigations report. Liechtenstein calls on Ethiopia to end all communications and internet shutdowns put in place which severely infringe upon human rights of the affected population and threaten their safety. It is further of vital importance to grant immediate, full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access to Tigray and other regions affected by the conflict. The protection of civilians needs to be prioritized, and both human rights and international humanitarian law need to be upheld. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Germany for a video statement.
Madam President, Germany aligns with the EU statement. We remain deeply concerned about the conflict in northern Ethiopia and its regional implications. We urge the government of Ethiopia and the TPLF to enter into ceasefire negotiations and political dialogue without preconditions. Faced by a worsening humanitarian crisis, persistent obstructions of humanitarian assistance and attacks on humanitarian workers are deeply worrisome. Full, safe, and unfettered humanitarian access by all parties is vital to millions of people. We remain deeply concerned about serious human rights violations and abuses, including sexual and gender-based violence, killings of civilians, and ethnically targeted violence. Madam High Commissioner, we look forward to receiving the findings of your office's joint investigation. Transparent and thorough investigations must be timely and perpetrators be held accountable. We hope the report will contribute to ensure justice for victims. While the joint report will focus on Tigray, how do you assess the alleged human rights violations in other parts of northern Ethiopia and possible steps to hold perpetrators to account? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to France on Zoom.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. La France remercie la haute commissaire pour sa présentation. La situation au Tigré reste préoccupante, presque un an après le début du conflit, et malgré les appels répétés de la communauté internationale pour que les hostilités cessent. Nous condamnons une nouvelle fois les violations des droits de l'homme et du droit international humanitaire commises par l'ensemble des parties, dont des exécutions extrajudiciaires, des violences sexuelles et des déplacements forcés. Ces actes doivent faire l'objet d'enquêtes indépendantes. Nous attendons des autorités qu'elles mettent en œuvre les engagements pris en matière de lutte contre l'impunité. La France soutient l'enquête conjointe du Haut-Commissariat et de la Commission éthiopienne des droits de l'homme, tout en regrettant les difficultés rencontrées dans la collecte de preuves et le déploiement des enquêteurs. Madame la Présidente, la situation humanitaire et l'insécurité alimentaire qui continuent de s'aggraver nécessitent que toutes les parties garantissent un accès humanitaire sûr et sans entrave. La France reste mobilisée avec ses partenaires pour faciliter l'acheminement de l'aide et le travail des humanitaires en Éthiopie. Seul un processus politique inclusif est aujourd'hui capable de faire taire les armes. Il n'existe aucune solution militaire au conflit. La France restera mobilisée, y compris au sein de ce Conseil, pour que la situation au Tigré continue de faire l'objet d'un suivi attentif. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I give the floor to Greece for a video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam High Commissioner, Greece aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks you for your update. We are gravely concerned by the conflict in Tigray, its extension in Amhara and Afar, and at the risk of further exacerbation of conflict in Ethiopia. Furthermore, we express our alarm at the reported killings of humanitarian workers and of obstruction of humanitarian assistance. Full, safe, and unfettered humanitarian access must be ensured. We call on all parties to cease all grave international humanitarian law violations and human rights violations and abuses for which accountability is of paramount importance. Allegations must be investigated and perpetrators held accountable. We moreover call on all parties involved to take necessary steps to ensure the safety of journalists who must be protected, including from harassment, threats, detention, or censorship. Eritrea's role in the ongoing crisis is also of grave concern. Greece calls for the immediate withdrawal of Eritrean defense forces present in Ethiopia. Finally, we look forward to receiving the findings of the investigations of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the OHCHR. As the date of their publication draws nearer, and in view of the evolution of the situation, we stress that scrutiny must not end, and in that regard, encourage the High Commissioner to keep the Council updated as deemed necessary. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Luxembourg for a video statement.
Je vous remercie. Le Luxembourg s'associe à la déclaration de l'Union européenne. Ma délégation remercie la haute commissaire pour son rapport oral. Nous encourageons la finalisation rapide du rapport de l'enquête conjointe par votre bureau et la Commission éthiopienne des droits de l'homme et espérons que le rapport sera disponible au 1er novembre au plus tard. L'élargissement du conflit au Tigré, aux régions d'Afar et d'Amara est plus que préoccupante et le Luxembourg reste profondément inquiet par la situation des droits humains et l'impact humanitaire. Nous sommes choqués par la gravité et l'ampleur des crimes sexuels commis contre les femmes et les filles au Tigré et condamnons fermement l'utilisation de la violence sexuelle comme arme de guerre. Il est impératif qu'une enquête internationale indépendante soit menée pour en finir avec l'impunité. Le coût humain de ce conflit est alarmant. Près de 7 millions de personnes ont besoin d'une aide d'urgence, 400 000 personnes sont déjà menacées de famine et 100 000 enfants sont confrontés à une malnutrition aiguë, sans compter les millions de personnes déplacées. Nous appelons toutes les parties au conflit à cesser immédiatement les hostilités et d'assurer un accès humanitaire sans restriction au Tigré. Comme l'a constaté le secrétaire général, il n'y a pas de solution militaire à ce conflit. Un cessez-le-feu durable est primordial pour créer les conditions nécessaires au début d'un dialogue politique afin de trouver une sortie à cette crise. Merci.
Thank you. I give the floor to Spain for a video statement.
España agradece la actualización oral de la alta comisionada sobre la situación en Tigray. Expresa su más honda preocupación por el conflicto en la región de Tigray y su extensión a las regiones limítrofes, donde, a pesar del alto el fuego, han seguido produciéndose graves violaciones y abusos de derechos humanos contra la población civil, incluyendo violencia sexual usada como arma de guerra, así como la violencia étnica y el discurso de odio. Mi país destaca la importancia de garantizar la rendición de cuentas por dichas violaciones y abusos de derechos humanos, la justicia y reparación para las víctimas, así como la restauración del Estado de Derecho. La investigación conjunta entre su oficina y la Comisión de Derechos Humanos de Etiopía representa sin lugar a dudas un valioso instrumento al servicio de estos y otros objetivos. Llamamos al respeto del derecho internacional humanitario, permitiendo, entre otros, el pleno acceso a la ayuda humanitaria, e instamos a todas las partes a poner fin a la violencia y violaciones de derechos humanos, a la retirada de las fuerzas extranjeras, así como a iniciar un necesario diálogo nacional sobre la reconciliación. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Venezuela on Zoom.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Venezuela se asocia a la declaración de Etiopía a nombre del LNG. Reconocemos la colaboración que ha brindado el gobierno de Etiopía en la investigación conjunta adelantada por la Comisión de Derechos Humanos y la Oficina de la Alta Comisionada sobre la situación de los derechos humanos en la región de Tigray, la cual debe continuar de manera independiente. Al respecto, el país también trabaja en estrecha colaboración con la Comisión Africana de Derechos Humanos y de los Pueblos. En el marco de los esfuerzos para abordar los desafíos en la región de Tigray, nos complace que el gobierno etíope haya declarado un cese al fuego humanitario unilateral actualmente en vigor. Señora presidenta, tenemos un firme compromiso con el respeto de la soberanía, la integridad territorial y la independencia política de Etiopía. Lo que acontece en la región de Tigray es un asunto que compete a Etiopía, que trabaja arduamente para solventar la situación. A pesar de su completa colaboración, nos preocupan los intentos de politización de este delicado asunto en este Consejo. El gobierno etíope continúa firme en su empeño de someter a la justicia a quienes hayan cometido violaciones a los derechos humanos. Sigamos apoyando a Etiopía en su compromiso de cumplir cabalmente con sus obligaciones nacionales e internacionales en materia de derechos humanos. Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you. I give the floor to Austria for a video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. We welcome the joint investigation of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the OHCHR into the human rights abuses in the context of the Tigray conflict. We urge for the report to be published as soon as possible. We are seriously concerned about the killing of civilians, sexual and gender-based violence, indiscriminate shelling, and the forced displacement of residents of Tigray and Eritrean refugees. The Ethiopian government and the TPLF, as well as associated regional militias, must end the fighting now and move toward a negotiated ceasefire immediately and without preconditions. We are also alarmed by the humanitarian situation in Tigray, with an estimated 5.2 million people in need of food, including 400,000 people already facing famine-like conditions. We urge the Ethiopian authorities to ensure that members of the armed and security forces immediately cease obstructions to humanitarian assistance and ensure immediate and unhindered access. Finally, Austria remains deeply concerned by Eritrean troops in Ethiopia's Tigray region and by credible reports that they are committing grave human rights abuses and forcibly returning Eritrean refugees to Eritrea. We urge Eritrea to withdraw its troops immediately. All alleged violations of international human rights and humanitarian law committed by any party to the conflict must be thoroughly investigated and the perpetrators held to account. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Netherlands for a video statement.
Madam High Commissioner, the Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement. We remain extremely concerned about the still expanding conflict in Ethiopia. It becomes more apparent every day that the fruitless pursuit of a military solution only comes at the expense of Ethiopian citizens. We echo the call by the UN Secretary General for foreign forces to leave the country, for humanitarian access to be guaranteed for all areas in need, resumption of essential services, and for an inclusive national political dialogue to take place. This requires all parties to commit to a ceasefire. We are particularly concerned about the safety of humanitarian workers. They must be able to do their work in safety and without obstruction. The joint investigation of the OHCHR and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission can be an important milestone. It can help establish the facts and catalyze the process towards justice for victims and survivors. All those responsible for potential war crimes and violations and abuses of human rights law in northern Ethiopia must be held accountable. We call on the Council to engage with the report after its public release in November with the seriousness the situation deserves. We encourage the High Commissioner to brief the Council intersessionally. The question: what commitments did you receive from those responsible for violations and abuses of human rights and international humanitarian law to implement the recommendations that will be presented in the report? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the United States for a video statement.
Thank you, Madam High Commissioner. The United States calls for OHCHR and Ethiopian Human Rights Commission's report to be released without delay. We also welcome Madam High Commissioner to conduct an intersessional briefing with the Council on the findings of the report once it is released. We strongly condemn the human rights violations and abuses occurring in northern Ethiopia, including unspeakable brutal acts of violence committed against women and girls. Those responsible must be held accountable through independent, transparent processes. We are deeply concerned that the Ethiopian government and regional authorities continue to impede humanitarian access. We demand all parties allow unhindered humanitarian access. We are also gravely concerned by the presence and actions of Eritrean defense forces in Ethiopia and call for their immediate withdrawal. We condemn the Tigray People Liberation Front's expansion of the conflict and are concerned by reports of abuses, such as reported attacks against Eritrean refugees. We urge all parties to end hostilities and for the Ethiopian government and the TPLF to enter into negotiations without preconditions toward a sustainable ceasefire. Our question is, how can the international community support accountability efforts that are complementary to your investigation? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Russian Federation for a video statement.
Госпожа председатель, внимательно следим за развитием ситуации в Эфиопии, прежде всего в регионе Тиграй. Гуманитарная обстановка в регионе остается сложной. Особую озабоченность вызывают попытки тиграйских сил перекрыть маршруты доставки гумпомощи, в частности, взятие под свой контроль стратегической трассы, связывающей Эфиопию с Джибути. Отмечаем, что федеральное правительство продолжает вносить значительный вклад в управление ситуацией. Приветствуем готовность Аддис-Абебы провести беспристрастное расследование фактов гибели гражданского населения и других преступлений, совершенных в ходе боестолкновений в Тиграе. Поддерживаем проводимую ООН работу по скорейшему запуску политического диалога. Убеждены, что он должен вести с самими эфиопами при поддержке прежде всего африканского сообщества. Любое внешнее содействие должно осуществляться при неукоснительном соблюдении суверенитета, территориальной целостности и политической независимости страны. Считаем, что попытки расшатать ситуацию, оказать давление на демократически избранное правительство Эфиопии, в том числе путем принятия односторонних санкций, путь к еще большему разрастанию конфликта. Призываем международное сообщество и региональные организации поддержать шаги властей Эфиопии по нормализации ситуации в Тиграе, возвращению региона к миру и восстановлению нормальной жизни населения. Благодарю за внимание.
Thank you. I give the floor to New Zealand for a video statement.
Madam President, New Zealand is deeply concerned at continuing reports of human rights violations and abuses and serious violations of international humanitarian law by parties to the conflict in Tigray and Ethiopia. We are alarmed at the spread of violence across Ethiopia and urge parties to avoid escalating violence and to prevent attacks on civilians. New Zealand calls for all parties, internal and external, to commit to a genuine ceasefire and engage in a constructive political dialogue. There is no long-term military solution, only a political pathway to peace. We appeal to all forces to return to their pre-conflict boundaries. New Zealand condemns reports of sexual and gender-based violence in Ethiopia. We are deeply concerned by the use of sexual violence against women and girls and deplore the use of gendered violence as a tactic of war. New Zealand supports the joint OHCHR Ethiopian Human Rights Commission investigation and the African Union-led Commission of Inquiry on Tigray. We urge full cooperation and transparency and encourage all parties to implement the recommendations of independent human rights investigations. New Zealand commends the critical life-saving work of the United Nations, Ethiopian, and international organizations providing humanitarian support in Tigray and Ethiopia. We condemn the ongoing violence against humanitarians, call for the blockade to end, and for all parties to enable the safe and unfettered flow of humanitarian aid and personnel. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Ireland for a video statement.
Ireland aligns with the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner for her update. We remain extremely concerned by the deteriorating human rights and humanitarian situation in Tigray and in neighbouring regions. We are shocked by the horrifying reports of gross human rights violations and abuses that continue to define this conflict. They include widespread and systematic sexual and gender-based violence, which is completely unacceptable and must end. People will continue to die unless unimpeded humanitarian access is provided immediately to all in need. We call on all parties to end the ongoing violence now, commit to a lasting ceasefire, and enter a process of inclusive political dialogue. All parties should also refrain from inflammatory and dehumanizing language, which continues to fuel tensions. Those responsible for violations of international humanitarian, human rights, and refugee law must be held to account through independent, transparent, and credible processes. We strongly support the work of the OHCHR and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission in jointly investigating allegations of human rights violations in Tigray. Timely publication of the investigation findings will be a critical step towards accountability. Continued international attention will be essential to ending the conflict and ensuring its victims are not forgotten. High Commissioner, how can the international community best support efforts to ensure accountability for human rights violations in Tigray and in neighbouring Amhara and Afar regions? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Belgium for a video statement.
My delegation is very concerned by the continuing violence in Tigray and surrounding areas, as well as by the accompanying reports of serious human rights violations. Belgium calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities with a view to guaranteeing safe and unimpeded access for relief workers to address the unfolding humanitarian emergency. The clock is ticking. We furthermore await with anticipation the publication of the report on the joint investigation. Its conclusions and recommendations need to be given due consideration and follow-up. The fight against impunity in particular is of paramount importance to stop the vicious circle of ethno-political conflict. As such, those identified as responsible for human rights violations and abuses need to be held accountable regardless of their affiliation. Finally, I would like to seize this opportunity to emphasize that only a political settlement of this and other conflicts in Ethiopia through negotiations and national dialogue can produce sustainable peace and stability, which itself is a precondition for the continued development and prosperity of Ethiopian society. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to China for a video statement.
主席女士，中国支持埃塞俄比亚维护国家主权和统一的努力。我们希望埃塞有关各方通过政治对话化解矛盾分歧，缓解紧张局势，避免冲突进一步扩大，为实现和平和解创造条件。中方希望国际社会支持埃塞政府实现全面持久停火， 推动民族和解，反对外部势力以人权为名干涉埃塞内政。人权高专办可根据埃塞政府的要求提供建设性帮助。埃塞政府为改善提格雷及周边地区人道状况做出了大量努力，国际社会应予以鼓励。个别国家对埃塞施加的单边制裁不符合国际法和国际关系基本准则，无助于化解矛盾，只会对政治解决形成干扰。中方将继续支持埃塞人民实现国家和平稳定与发展繁荣，相信埃塞政府有能力、有智慧克服困难，处理好内部事务，妥善应对当前挑战。中方愿同国际社会共同努力，支持埃塞致力于民族团结、恢复稳定、实现发展。谢谢主持女士。
Thank you. I give the floor to Italy on Zoom.
Italy aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union and welcomes the High Commissioner of Human Rights' oral update on the situation on human rights in the Tigray region. We remain deeply concerned about the ongoing military escalation, expanding from Tigray to the regions of Amhara and Afar. We reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire and the withdrawal of foreign forces from Ethiopia. All parties should cooperate to ensure full respect of international humanitarian law and for safe and unhindered humanitarian access, especially to the benefit of those who are in the most vulnerable situations. Human rights violations and abuses must stop, including sexual and gender-based violence, ethnically targeted violence, as well as hate speech. The start of the genuine process of national dialogue is undeferrable and has to be inclusive. All those responsible for the serious violation and abuses of human rights must nonetheless be held accountable through impartial and independent investigations. We therefore support the joint investigation that the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights have conducted so far and look forward to discussing its findings within the Human Rights Council. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Sri Lanka for a video statement.
Madam President, Sri Lanka opposes initiatives moved within this council that do not enjoy the consent of the country concerned. Such initiatives run counter to the core principles of General Assembly Resolution 60/251 and the IB package. Resolution 47/13 does not enjoy the support of Ethiopia and therefore is counterproductive and undermines the spirit of cooperation required in promoting and protecting human rights. The right of a state to defend its territorial integrity is a long-established principle of international law and an essential corollary of statehood. Article 2, subsection 4 of the UN Charter calls on all members to respect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of other states. We recognize the right of Ethiopia to address law and order challenges that threaten to undermine its territorial integrity. Sri Lanka appreciates the progressive legislative and institutional reforms undertaken by Ethiopia and measures taken by national law enforcement authorities to address human rights concerns. We encourage the international community to be cautious and cooperative in its approach to ensure that the remarkable national progress achieved by Ethiopia and its people is not jeopardized. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to UN Women for a video statement.
UN Women welcomes the opportunity to share an update, particularly on the situation of sexual and gender-based violence in Tigray region of Ethiopia. UN Women is deeply concerned over the widespread and systematic commission of rape and sexual violence in Tigray. Sexual violence in conflict disproportionately impacts women and girls and causes grave and lasting harm to survivors, their families, and communities, posing major barriers to peace and development. UN Women is supporting the joint investigation by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission with specific expertise on the documentation of sexual and gender-based violence. We expect that this forthcoming investigation will provide further clarity on the magnitude of the situation, and we will adapt our response accordingly. While noting high rates of conflict-related sexual violence, UN Women is concerned with the fragmented and limited services related to prevention, risk mitigation, and response to such grave violations, including referral pathways for survivors. UN Women urges the engagement of all parties to ensure that obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law are upheld, to guarantee safe and unimpeded access by humanitarian organizations to provide much-needed life-saving assistance to women and girls survivors of violence, to protect civilian populations, particularly women and girls, and to take action to hold to account perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Philippines for a video statement.
Madam President, our delegation voted against the unilateral resolution HRC47/13. This position is based on the Philippines' principled position against actions that do not enjoy the support of the concerned country. We deeply regret the failure of the resolution's proponents to cooperate in a constructive manner with the concerned country and the consequent strain and burden on the already stretched resources for supporting the Council's ever-increasing mandates. From the outset, the Philippines has been encouraged by the open and good faith engagement by the government of Ethiopia with the international community, its support for the ongoing independent joint investigation by the High Commissioner and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, and its commitment to accountability and investigations into alleged violations of human rights and humanitarian laws. We note the OHCHR's media advisory of September 10, which informed that the independent joint investigation had concluded its fieldwork and that its final report would be released on 1 November. We also note the commitment by the government of Ethiopia to respect and be guided by the result of the joint investigation. This enhanced interactive dialogue therefore reflects inefficiencies and redundancies and should prompt an introspection on the part of the pen holders. Apart from the question of inefficiency, the Council should also refrain from actions that seek to influence or preempt the outcome of an ongoing independent investigation process, whose result is forthcoming in 2 months as reported by the OHCHR itself. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the United Kingdom on Zoom.
Thank you, Madam President. The United Kingdom is grateful for the High Commissioner's update. We welcome the joint investigation by the OHCHR and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. The conflict in Ethiopia has entered its 11th month, with both sides continuing to pursue a futile military solution. Over 400,000 people are experiencing famine conditions. Yet the government is presiding over a de facto blockade of Tigray, and the Tigray People's Liberation Front has expanded the conflict into Amhara and Afar states, causing more human suffering. The UK is concerned by the many reports of brutal and systematic sexual violence, of massacres, of forced displacement of people along ethnic lines, and of indiscriminate shelling of towns. There's been growing incidents of hate speech and discrimination. Humanitarian workers have become targets, and 23 have been killed. If the situation does not improve, Ethiopia will be the scene of a human tragedy on a scale unparalleled this century. As a long-standing friend of Ethiopia, the UK calls for the fighting to stop and for unfettered humanitarian access and for the international humanitarian law and human rights law to be respected. We welcome the upcoming publication of the report of the joint investigation and call on the High Commissioner to hold an intersessional briefing for members as soon as possible thereafter, followed by a thorough process to enable the full implementation of its recommendations. We welcome thoughts from the High Commissioner on how this can be achieved. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Sudhan on Zoom. Sudhan, you have the floor.
شكرا السيدة الرئيسة. يرحب السودان بمشاركة السيدة المفوضة سامي لحقوق الإنسان في هذه الجلسة ويشكرها على تقديم تحديثها الشفوي بشأن الأوضاع في إقليم التيغراي. يود السودان أن يؤكد أنه ظل يتابع تطورات الأوضاع في إقليم التيغراي باهتمام بالغ، وذلك للعديد من الاعتبارات، أهمها روابط الجوار والتاريخ والجغرافيا والثقافة المشتركة التي تجمع الشعب السوداني بالشعب الإثيوبي الشقيق. وقد فتح السودان حدوده واستقبل أكثر من 90,000 لاجئين من مواطنين الإثيوبيين، خاصة من قوميتي تيغراي والأمهرة الذين فروا من مناطقهم جراء الصراع الدائر في إقليم تيغراي منذ نوفمبر من العام الماضي، رغما عن الظروف الاقتصادية بالغة التعقيد التي يمر بها السودان. يود السودان أن يؤكد أنه سيواصل العمل مع المجتمع الدولي لتقديم المساعدات الإنسانية للاجئين الإثيوبيين الموجودين على أراضيه، ويأمل أن يعمل المجتمع الدولي على الوفاء بالالتزامات التي عهد بها من أجل تقديم الخدمات الضرورية لهؤلاء اللاجئين، خاصة وأن ما قدم حتى الآن لم يتجاوز 45% من جملة التعهدات المقطوعة. سيدة الرئيسة، نود أن نشير بقلق إلى أن السلطات السودانية عثرت خلال الشهر الماضي على عدد من جثث اللاجئين الأثيوبيين حملها نهر الستيت في شرق البلاد إلى داخل الأراضي السودانية، ويعتقد أن الجثث التي بدأت عليها آثار التعذيب وإطلاق نار تعود لإثنية محددة. وقد قامت السلطات السودانية بموجب التزاماتها الأخلاقية والإنسانية بإبلاغ الحكومة الإثيوبية بالحادث. ختاما، يأمل السودان أن تعمل جميع الأطراف في جمهورية إثيوبيا الاتحادية على وقف كافة العمليات العسكرية والسعي للتوصل إلى تسوية سياسية تنهي حالة النزاع المسلح التي تضرر منها ملايين من الشعب الإثيوبي الشقيق. شكرا سيدة الرئيسة.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the Islamic Republic of Iran. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. The Islamic Republic of Iran reiterates the imperative for this Council to fulfill its mandate in protection and promotion of human rights on the basis of genuine dialogue and cooperation in accordance with the principles of non-selectivity, objectivity, and impartiality, and away from politicization or double standard. The primary responsibility of states to promote and protect human rights of their people is well established. Sovereign states are entitled to cooperate and engage with the UN human rights bodies and mechanisms based on their consent and request. The Islamic Republic of Iran notes the oral updates made by Madam High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. We welcome the measures taken by the government of Ethiopia to facilitate the ongoing joint investigation by the OHCHR and Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. We call upon all relevant parties to continue their important engagement in order to ensure the protection of human rights. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Cuba.
Gracias, Presidenta. Cuba reitera su rechazo a la realización de ejercicios en el marco del Consejo por imposición de los países desarrollados, que no cuentan con el apoyo del país concernido y constituyen obstáculos para una pronta solución. El Consejo y demás mecanismos de derechos humanos deben alejarse de la politización, la selectividad y los dobles raseros en el
click to resort to military adventures, as well as on the real threat it continues to pose to the national security of Eritrea and Ethiopia. It is essential that the OHCHR takes the defunct TPLF clique as the main cause and the only culprit in the crisis situation. In the event, Eritrea will give its full response again on the issue when the report is fully released. Nonetheless, it continues to reject the ongoing attempts to deflect attention from the crimes the clique perpetrated and downplaying its culpability. The enhanced interactive dialogue on the Tigray region of Ethiopia under discussion thus remains unfair and destructive, stands aiming at undermining the responsibilities of sovereign government while appeasing the TPLF criminal clique. The practice will ruin the inherent self-defense right, the common understanding to the constitutional duty of governments to mitigate imminent threats to their national security and the need to fight terrorism whenever and wherever they occur. Above all, it perpetuates terrorism and anarchy and undermines sovereignty, states capable of doing and administering their own affairs. After the unilateral ceasefire, TPLF has continued its desperate defenses in the Afar and Amhara region of Ethiopia by using children and untrained soldiers, and had clearly stated its intention to again attack Eritrea once it succeeds to overthrow the government of Ethiopia.
Thank you, but I'm sorry, but your time is up. We will now turn to our list of speakers for non-government organizations, and I give the floor to the Eastern Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Project.
Madam President, Madam High Commissioner, we thank you for your presentation, which provides an overview of the dire situation in Tigray. The armed conflict in the region is complex. Multiple actors are involved. Egregious violations against civilians and Eritrean refugees, including sexual violence, have been documented. All perpetrators must be held to account. The conflict has spilled over to neighboring regions, namely Afar and Amhara. Violence increasingly along ethnic lines and carried out by militias is mounting and threatens to spread across the entire country. The absolute priority is the cessation of hostilities by all parties and de-escalation of tensions. At the last session, by ensuring reporting and debates on Tigray, the Human Rights Council took an important step. Council action is legitimate in itself and as a complement to national and regional efforts, as well as the joint OHCHR-EHRC investigation. We urge the Ethiopian authorities to continue cooperating with the joint investigation and to accept and engage with any findings, as well as to implement other expert recommendations, including by OHCHR and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights Commission of Inquiry, to improve the situation. When ready, the findings of the joint investigation should be made public. All parties must own the report and its recommendations. This is the only path to ending the violations and preventing their recurrence. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the Society for Threatened Peoples.
Thank you, Madam President. Regarding the escalating conflict in Tigray, Society for Threatened Peoples is deeply concerned about the actions undertaken by the Ethiopian state forces, which might amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. The Tigrayan civil population appears to be a target of war crimes and indeed victims of violations of international humanitarian law. In addition, Society for Threatened Peoples would like to raise awareness to the issue that Tigrayans living in Addis Ababa are victims of arbitrary detentions and state-sanctioned closure of businesses. Society for Threatened Peoples calls upon the UN Human Rights Council to consider accusing Ahmed Abiy of incitement to genocide deriving from the words he used towards the Finnish Minister of Foreign Affairs, namely that he was going to wipe out the Tigrayans for the next 100 years. Furthermore, we would like to ask the UN Human Rights Council to recommend to the UN Security Council to file a case against Ahmed Abiy at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. In addition, Society for Threatened Peoples asks the UN Human Rights Council to pressurize Ahmed Abiy politically to seek some form of deal with Tigrayan leaders, grant humanitarian access to Tigray, and restore telecommunications, electricity, and banking, as well as ensure access to drinking water and food for the Tigrayan civil population. Thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the Center for Human Rights.
The Center for Human Rights wishes to call the attention of the Human Rights Council to the human rights situation in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. We note the joint investigation of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Ethiopian National Human Rights Commission on the human rights crisis in the Tigray region. We also note the resolution of the Human Rights Council expressing concerns about human rights abuses in the Tigray region. We further note that the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, the primary body tasked with the promotion and protection of human rights on the African continent, established a commission of inquiry to investigate allegations of violations of human rights in the Tigray region. Madam President, the Center for Human Rights reiterates the added benefits of complementarity in the working modalities between the United Nations and African Union human rights mechanisms, particularly the African Commission on Human and People's Rights in addressing the ongoing humanitarian crisis in the Tigray region. The Center for Human Rights encourages a people-centered and urgent intervention in pursuit of a lasting resolutions of the issues fueling the crisis in the Tigray region. The Center also encourages enhanced cooperation between the United Nations and African Union human rights mechanisms as set up in the 2012 Addis Ababa Roadmap.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Christian Solidarity Worldwide.
Thank you, Madam President. Since war began in Ethiopia's Tigray region last November, over 52,000 people have died and an estimated 1.7 million have been displaced internally. There are worrying indications atrocity crimes may have occurred and could still be underway, in addition to ongoing gross violations of humanitarian law. We remain deeply concerned by reports of mass rape and starvation being used as weapons of war, of the targeting of Tigray's religious and cultural heritage, and the dire humanitarian situation, with millions on the brink of famine, a de facto siege, and deaths already occurring. We are further troubled by recent reports of thousands of Eritrean troops and possibly conscripted minors entering the Ohchr region. Successive international calls and regional proposals to secure a ceasefire, the withdrawal of Eritrean troops, and unhindered humanitarian access have gone unheeded. Despite the grave ramifications of a war which poses an existential threat to Ethiopia and to regional peace and security, CSW urges the international community to act swiftly. The imposition of an arms embargo on all identified warring parties and the facilitation of an inclusive national dialogue could be important initial steps. Madam President, we welcome today's update and look forward to the findings of the joint investigation's final report. However, while partnering with a commission financed and appointed by one of the main protagonists may ensure access, there are legitimate residual concerns given the mistreatment and intimidation endured by several Ethiopian journalists who reported objectively. We therefore encourage this Council to consider mandating a fully independent inquiry into ongoing human rights violations. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Center for Global Non-Killing.
Madam President, dear human beings, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, greetings of peace and of understanding. The Center for Global Non-Killing stands for each and every life. This is the right to life. Life can only be fully protected when peace prevails. This is the right to peace. Ethiopia and Eritrea are members of the United Nations. As such, peace-loving nations bound to solve their conflicts peacefully and to refrain from use of force. This is our common future. They are bound by the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, by humanitarian law, and by the duty to oversee the activities of the military personnel, by the duty to provide security for the good of the people and for public order. This is good governance. The means to quell violence without being violent greatly need to progress, yet they are available to all of us. The culture of peace, shared values and education, cooperation, prevention of conflict and of violence, and if it failed, universal peaceful settlements of disputes. And if these fail as well, non-violence, and more than not, non-killing. This is best practices. Eritrea and Ethiopia have both supported the General Assembly Right to Peace Declaration in 2016. This is the time to implement. We hereby proclaim and recall that every person has the right to live in peace, especially in Tigray. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the Coordination of Associations for Freedom of Conscience.
There is a war in Ethiopia. It started with the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, attacking the Ethiopian Defense Force of the government of Abiy Ahmed. In this conflict, Amhara women and children are being killed and their villages are looted both by TPLF and governmental forces. These have been obvious in lands annexed from the Amharas by force 30 years ago by the TPLF. Moreover, Amhara farming families are victims of killings and lootings in non-war zones of Benshangul Gums and Oromia. Elderly people and babies have been massacred in these regions. Today, over 2 million Amharas are displaced throughout the country. They are living without any assistance from the government nor from the international community. We call upon the international community to take into consideration the atrocities committed against Amhara civilians in the war between Tigray and the central government of Ethiopia, to provide humanitarian assistance to Amhara victims, to bring the perpetrators of crimes against humanity to justice, and to stop propagating TPLF propaganda. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Amnesty International.
Madam President, since the conflict in Tigray started in November 2020, many of us have been wondering how critical the situation must get for the international community, including this council, to robustly respond. Despite limited access for human rights organizations to the affected regions and severe communications restrictions, Amnesty International and other human rights organizations have managed to document enough evidence of human rights and international humanitarian law violations to prove that the situation is critical and requires action from the international community. We have shared evidence of horrifying massacres that constitute war crimes and may amount to crimes against humanity. We have warned that the humanitarian situation has worsened with time as the Ethiopian government continues to restrict access for aid and aid workers to the region. We have shared evidence of how women and girls have been subjected to rape and other sexual violences by forces aligned with the Ethiopian government. And now new allegations of abuses by the TPLF in the offensive in Afar and Amhara regions have emerged, which Amnesty International is trying to investigate. Madam President, we urge this council to do more to protect the rights of the people of Ethiopia, to contribute to accountability for grave crimes, and to do all it can to avert further violations and abuses, to do more to strengthen synergies with important regional efforts, in particular the COI, created by the African Commission, to stand with victims and survivors in the pursuit of justice. We urge this council to respond with urgency to the findings of the OHCHR and the EHCR joint investigation, as well as those of the African Commission COI at the earliest possible opportunity, and play its role in contributing to holding perpetrators to account. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Human Rights Watch.
Today's dialogue on Tigray, 10 months into a devastating conflict, is a welcome if belated step towards international scrutiny and accountability. Ethiopia's federal government continues its de facto blockade of the Tigray region. On September 2, a UN official said that food supplies to support millions in need had run out. One convoy has since reached Tigray, but daily aid deliveries are critical. Abuses against civilians have continued. In August, about 50 bodies were reportedly found in a river bordering western Tigray. Outside of Tigray, Ethiopian authorities have forcibly disappeared scores of ethnic Tigrayans. Ethiopian government forces and their allies have committed numerous rights and laws of war violations, including massacres, sexual violence, forced displacement, and deliberate attacks on civilian infrastructure. The conflict has spilled over into the Amhara and Afar regions. The fighting has already forced tens of thousands of civilians to flee their homes. Reports of killings and looting have increased. In light of the decision to release the joint OHCHR and Ethiopian Human Rights Commission report by November, we encourage the High Commissioner to hold an intersessional briefing on Tigray as part of her global mandate before the year's end. Given the gravity of the crimes committed and the range of actors involved, domestic accountability will not suffice. Human Rights Council action and OHCHR's global work needs to be sustained. We hope the joint investigation will lay the foundation for an international mechanism to be established by the Human Rights Council as a matter of urgency.
Thank you. I give the floor to the International Bar Association.
Thank you. The International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute is extremely concerned about the escalation of the crisis in Ethiopia, in particular in Tigray. The 10-month conflict has forced millions to flee their homes and left millions more in a desperate humanitarian situation. The ongoing atrocities committed by all parties are compounded by Ethiopia's government repeatedly cutting basic services to the region. Scores have been targeted, including lawyers supporting persecuted individuals and journalists and media workers covering the situation in the country. Critical internet and telecommunication shutdowns and blocking of websites have enabled the government to control information. In Tigray, security forces have been ordered to carry out a wide range of abuses against Tigrayans, resulting in hundreds of arbitrary arrests and detentions, torture and forced disappearances. There is also evidence of the systematic use of rape and sexual violence against Tigrayan women, including gang rape and sex slavery. Given the seriousness of the ongoing crisis, the extent of the atrocities, and the gravity and complexity of the situation, we call on this Council to ensure a robust, dedicated, and coordinated response without any further delay and duly fulfill its mandate to address and prevent gross human rights violations. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Civicus.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, High Commission, for this timely update, which indicates serious violations of international law, possibly amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Civicus is partly concerned about the continued reports of extrajudicial killings, widespread serious sexual violence, as well as destruction of crops and refugee camps, attacks on civilian infrastructure, including factories, schools, and hospitals, underscored by obstruction of humanitarian assistance. Civil society organizations, including Norwegian Refugee Council, Médecins Sans Frontières, and Al Maktoum Foundation, have been suspended for doing their legitimate work. These suspensions hinder accessibility of humanitarian relief by the famine-stricken population and present a clear attempt to silence the public communication of humanitarian organizations operating in the region. Reported telecommunication restrictions in order to control communication channels have left people unable to access key information and mandate and made it harder for victims and witnesses of violations to share their testimony. While we welcome the commitments made by the government of Ethiopia to hold accountable those responsible for such abuses, the findings presented by the High Commissioner show the urgent need for the Human Rights Council to mandate an independent, transparent, and impartial investigations into the crimes reported, to further such measures and ensure that those responsible for these human rights abuses are held to account regardless of rank or affiliation. We thank you.
Thank you. And this was the last speaker on my list. I'm now going to give the floor to each of the panelists for their concluding remarks. And I give the floor to Madam High Commissioner, Ms. Michelle Bachelet.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank all delegations for their comments and questions. I would also like to reiterate my appreciation to the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission for the partnership in the joint investigation. This initiative should pave the way for a stronger collaboration with the Commission. As Daniel Bekele and I have indicated earlier, I wish to reiterate that the joint report will be publicly released at the latest on the 1st of November. As per standard practice, the draft final report will be shared with the concerned authorities for a 5-day fact-checking period prior to publication. The government of Ethiopia on multiple occasions, even during the last Human Rights Council session, noted its commitments to receiving the report and recommendations of the joint investigation. It is my sincere hope that the government will be willing to implement the recommendations, regardless of the perpetrators the joint investigation will identify. With regard to the involvement of Eritrean troops in human rights violation, my office has not received any feedback from the Eritrean government to our communications relating to allegations of human rights by Eritrean forces in Tigray. We will continue to engage with the Eritrean authorities in this regard, including calling for acceptance of relevant recommendations of the final report of the joint investigation. I take note of the proposal for holding an intersessional briefing once the report of the joint investigation has been issued. In line with previous practices, I am tentatively intending to brief member states before the end of the year on various thematic and country-specific things on human rights developments. So the findings of the joint investigation as part of the ongoing situation in Tigray could be part of such a briefing. I remain deeply concerned about the escalating tensions in Tigray and neighboring Afar and Amhara regions. The international community should support viable reconciliation and transitional justice processes anchored on human rights standards and reinforce the capacity of the judiciary, civil society organizations, and Ethiopian Human Rights Commission to address human rights violations in the longer term. The international community must continue to call for an end to the conflict and for an inclusive political dialogue. It must also continue to call on all parties to immediately end human rights violations and abuses, as well as violations of international humanitarian law. Accountability in redress for victims must be the absolute priority with a view to combating impunity and preventing a renewed cycle of violence. The need to document and investigate violations committed by all parties, regardless of their affiliation, with a view to establishing accountability, to combating impunity, and to contributing to redress for victims, does not end with the conclusion of the joint investigation, as regrettably serious human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law continue to be reported. As I said, the situation in Ethiopia is worrisome, and there are dangers of an expansion of the conflict to the entire Horn of Africa. Addressing the root causes of this conflict remain key, and I wish to reiterate the call for a peaceful resolution to the conflict and re-emphasize that protection of civilians is paramount to any negotiated end of the conflict. All grievances must also be adequately addressed. My office remains ready to support efforts in this regard. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Mr. Daniel Bekele for his concluding remarks.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me also express my appreciation to the High Commissioner and her representative in Addis, my brother Marcela Kopovo, for our joint work and partnership. Let me also express my appreciation for the global support from the world community for the joint investigation, as well as the commitment from the Ethiopian government to support the joint investigation. I really like to assure all of you that the joint investigation will continue to be guided by the highest standards of objectivity, independence, and impartiality to provide a faithful account of the human rights situation in Tigray. And it will definitely contribute to accountability, redress for victims, as well as the search for sustainable peace in Ethiopia. My second point, I wish to assure that the issues or human rights situations that are not covered under the joint investigation will definitely fall under the mandate of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission to continue to monitor the human rights situation in the country. So it will form a part of our ongoing monitoring work and activity. And I guess my final quick point, I would really like to appreciate the interest and engagement of the international community and friends of Ethiopia, indeed as it should be. But I would really like to reiterate my points that it will still be the people of Ethiopia who have the highest stake in putting an end to the suffering of their fellow Ethiopians. That's why I really sincerely believe that no amount of political righteousness or just cause would be worth the extent of human suffering that we have lived through this war in Ethiopia, both as a people and as a country. So I think it's very important that parties to the conflict, Ethiopians and friends of Ethiopia, demonstrate the humility that the solution is in Ethiopia, and the Ethiopian national, legal, and institutional parameters may be far from being perfect, but nevertheless, it remains the most relevant and the most cost-effective tools for addressing not only the human rights crisis, but as well as finding a sustainable solution for the political crisis we are in. So I think it's very important that we demonstrate humility to an acknowledgement and recognition of national processes and parameters for a sustainable solution for the political and human rights crisis we are facing as a people and a country. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Mr. Remy Ngoe Lumbu for his concluding remarks.
Merci, Madame, pour la parole que vous m'accordez. Je vous félicite pour le leadership avec lequel vous avez conduit cette séance d'après-midi. Nous félicitons en tant que Commission africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples le travail conjoint du Haut Commissariat aux droits de l'homme et de la Commission éthiopienne des droits de l'homme avec le soutien du gouvernement éthiopien à qui nous transmettons notre amitié et encourageons ces deux structures qui ont eu à travailler sur le terrain. La Commission africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples s'aligne derrière la déclaration pertinente du groupe d'États africains au Conseil des droits de l'homme sur la problématique du Tigré. Elle réaffirme que l'enquête qu'elle mène est indépendante et crédible et sollicite par cette voie le soutien de l'honorable gouvernement de la République fédérale démocratique d'Éthiopie. Elle tient cependant à rappeler que de par sa nature, la Commission n'est pas appelée à faire dans la politique et ne se concentre que sur la situation des droits de l'homme dans les 54 pays partis à la Charte africaine, en ce compris l'Éthiopie. Pour terminer, Madame la Présidente, la Commission africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples saisit cette occasion pour renouveler son offre de collaboration avec toutes les parties pour parachever le travail qu'elle effectue en parfaite harmonie avec la Charte africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Mr. Gideon Timotheus Essebon for his concluding remarks.
Excellency, Madam President, Excellency High Commissioner, distinguished delegates, I would like to take this opportunity to stress the fact that the deteriorating human rights situation in Afar and Amhara regions occurred due to the TPLF offensive, which was carried out in disregard to the unilateral humanitarian ceasefire declared by the government of Ethiopia. The government of Ethiopia, to discharge its obligation of protecting the human rights of civilians targeted by the TPLF, has no option but to take the necessary measures to neutralize the threat posed by the TPLF. I call upon the international community to engage with Ethiopia in a constructive and positive manner. International actions, including through this commission, that might constitute as unwarranted interference that fail to take into account the complexity of the situation and that erode the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ethiopia, will only derail the pursuit of durable solutions for the problem. We also reject attempts to hijack, divert, and use the joint investigation as a political instrument to advance the objective of certain powers. Finally, I also denounce the abusive language and the advocacy on behalf of a terrorist entity that we have witnessed from certain non-governmental organizations during this dialogue. Ethiopia remains committed to engage in a constructive and positive manner with all friends and partners to resolve the situation. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank you. And this brings us to the end of this enhanced interactive dialogue. I wish to thank all of the presenters for their participation today. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I understand that there has been a request to exercise a right of reply, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China. You have 3 minutes.
主席女士，中方对德国外长滥用人权理事会平台，基于虚假信息无端指责中国，肆意挑起对抗的做法表示坚决反对，完全拒绝。中国政府秉持以人民为中心的人权理念，始终将人民对美好生活的向往作为奋斗目标。中国全面建成小康社会，历史性解决绝对贫困问题，抗疫斗争取得重大战略成果，人权成就举世瞩目。中国各民族一律平等，各少数民族的合法权利充分得到保障。当前，中国新疆社会安宁稳定，经济繁荣发展，人民安居乐业。所谓中国居阿维吾尔族，完全是恶意污蔑。人权高专访华是友好访问，如果有国家企图推动人权高专对中国新疆进行有罪推定式的所谓调查，那他们是打错了算盘。香港是中国不可分离的一部分，香港事务纯属中国内政，不容任何外部势力干涉。香港国安法实施以来，香港民众的各项合法权利和自由在安全环境中得到更好行使。只有反华乱港分子再也不可能有勾结外国势力 危害国家安全的所谓自由。我们正告有关国家立即停止借涉港、涉疆问题进行政治操弄，干涉中国内政，遏制中国发展。如果这些国家继续编造谎言，企图把人权作为实现政治图谋的工具，必将遭到国际社会的共同唾弃和反对。谢谢主席女士。
Thank you. Is there any other delegation requesting the right of reply in relation to statements which have been made during the day? I see no requests for the floor. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of this meeting. We will reconvene tomorrow at 10 a.m. to hold the interactive dialogue on the report of the group of eminent international and regional experts on Yemen. I hereby close the second meeting of the 48th session of the Human Rights Council.